Tonight, one of this century's most ambitious projects at the largest reservoir in the nation, which looked like this in 2000. Take a look at what it looks like now. It was so low it could become useless to communities that rely on it. Instead of looking to the sky, engineers are looking miles beneath the surface to get water by essentially pulling the plug of the nation's biggest bathtub.
Right now, hundreds of feet beneath the...
Picture a bathtub the size of a small country, and someone pulled the plug 25 years ago. That is roughly what has happened to the largest reservoir in the United States. Today we're going to walk through why a desert city bet $1.5 billion on a hole drilled hundreds of feet under a lake bed, and why that bet may be the only reason the water keeps flowing when the taps run dry for everyone else. A structure born from desperation. In the early 1930s, the country was flat on its back. A quarter of the workforce had no job, banks were collapsing weekly, and the government needed something enormous to put people to work. What it settled on, in a scorched canyon on the Arizona-Nevada line, was a dam nobody was fully certain could be built. The Colorado River had spent generations swinging between violent spring floods and bone-dry summers, and no city downstream could plan around it. So the Bureau of Reclamation drew up plans for Hoover Dam. Construction crews, more than 5,000 at peak, worked in canyon heat that regularly topped 120 degrees, living in a purpose-built town called Boulder City because nothing else existed nearby. Over roughly 5 years, they poured enough concrete to pave a two-lane road from coast to coast. When the dam was finished in 1936, standing over 700 feet tall, it was the largest concrete structure human beings had ever made. Behind it, the river backed up into a reservoir that stretched better than 100 miles into the desert. Lake Mead. Filled to the brim, Lake Mead can hold roughly 26 million acre-feet of water. Enough, in theory, to supply every household in America for more than 10 years. Once the dam went up, the unpredictable river became something cities could actually build around. Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego. None of them could have grown into what they are today without power and water pulled from this one canyon. Hoover's turbines still split electricity across 3 states, with California taking the largest share, followed by Nevada and Arizona. It wasn't just concrete and rebar. It became a symbol that the country could still build something extraordinary in its worst moment. And even now, roughly 1 million visitors a year walk out onto its crest. A number that was never real. The trouble didn't start with drought. It started with paperwork 8 years before the dam was even finished. In November 1922, delegates from 7 states met in Santa Fe and carved up the Colorado River on paper. Half went to the upper basin, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico. Half went to the lower basin, Arizona, Nevada, California. A later treaty handed Mexico a further share. Added up, and the compact promised roughly 16.5 million acre-feet of water every single year, forever. The problem is that the negotiators based those numbers on river flow measurements taken between 1906 and 1929, one of the wettest stretches the Colorado has seen in centuries. They mistook an unusually generous run of years for the normal baseline. Triering and long-term climate records suggest the river's true historical average is closer to 13.5 million acre-feet a year, and since 2000 it has been delivering closer to 12 million. That means the states, tribes, and farms holding legal rights to the river are collectively owed roughly a quarter more water than the river actually produces most years. Somebody has to absorb that gap. For 2 decades, it has been Lake Mead, watching the water line fall. The decline has been slow enough to miss year to year and staggering to look at over decades. Around 2000, Lake Mead sat near its historic high, close to 1,200 feet above sea level. By the mid-2000s, it had slipped under 1,150. By 2010, under 1,100. Each dry year chipped away a little more than each wet year gave back, and the line only moved one direction. By 2016, the lake had fallen far enough to trigger the first formal federal shortage warnings. In 2021, it crossed the threshold for what regulators call a Tier 1 shortage, forcing mandatory cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico, with Arizona holding the most junior water rights, taking the deepest losses. Then, in 2022, the lake hit its lowest point since it was first filled in the 1930s. Boat ramps that had operated for generations sat stranded on cracked, dry ground. As the shoreline retreated, it exposed things that had been hidden underwater for half a century, including sunken vessels and, in one grim discovery, human remains. Researchers studying tree rings and other long-term climate evidence now describe the current period as the driest stretch the region has experienced in roughly 12 centuries. Not a bad season or two, but a fundamental shift, compounded by heat that pulls more water off the lake's surface and shrinks the mountain snowpack that's supposed to refill it every spring. The line at the bottom. Water managers have built a tiered system of shortage declarations, and each tier that the lake falls past triggers deeper cuts. At 1,075 feet, Arizona alone loses roughly 500,000 acre-feet a year. Push lower past 1,035 feet, and the consequences stop being just about allocation. That's the point where 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines can no longer generate power at all, cutting the dam's output by around 70%. Below that sit two thresholds that aren't about rationing anymore. They're about the system simply stopping. At 950 feet, the water sits too low to reach Hoover's turbine intakes, and the dam stops making electricity entirely. At 895 feet, a level engineers call dead pool. The water can no longer pass through the dam's outlet works by gravity at all. Nothing flows downstream. For every farm, city, and tribal community whose water rights assume the river keeps moving past that dam. Dead pool isn't a technical term. It's the end of the supply. As of the most recent readings, the lake sits roughly 160 feet above that line. That sounds like breathing room until you remember that in the year 2000, the cushion was twice that size, over 300 feet. The gap has been cut in half in 25 years, and nothing driving the decline. Reduced snowpack, hotter summers, a legal system that still promises more water than the river carries, has been resolved. 2026, the year the slack ran out. The 7 states sharing the river had been negotiating a long-term replacement for expiring water-sharing rules for over a decade, with a self-imposed deadline of February 2026. They missed it. Part of the reason was upstream. The Colorado system depends on snow falling in the Rockies, melting each spring, filling Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, and then being released down into Lake Mead. In the winter of 2025 into 2026, that snowpack came in at record lows, and an early spring heat wave burned off much of what little runoff there was before it could reach the reservoirs. Lake Powell dropped faster than officials had projected, and because Glen Canyon Dam, like Hoover, can only generate power above a certain water level, the Department of the Interior faced an ugly choice: protect Powell's own power generation by holding water back or keep releasing it downstream to prop up Lake Mead. In the spring of 2026, officials chose to protect Powell, cutting the release into Lake Mead by nearly 1.5 million acre-feet for the year, a decision the Bureau of Reclamation acknowledged could push Hoover's hydropower capacity down by as much as 40% by that fall. A few weeks later, a federal 24-month outlook projected Lake Mead could fall to roughly 1,021 feet by the summer of 2027, which would break the 2022 record low by more than 20 feet. The people who feel that first aren't in a boardroom. They're standing in Arizona fields that have been irrigated with river water for 100 years, watching allocations shrink until there's nothing left to plant. California, by contrast, holds senior rights protected until the lake drops to a level it hasn't reached yet. But when that threshold is finally crossed, the resulting fight over the state's share is expected to be the largest water dispute the American West has ever seen. In May 2026, 3 of the states proposed a temporary deal to leave more water in the system through 2028. The upper basin states didn't sign on, and no lasting agreement has been reached since. One city that refused to gamble. It's tempting to picture Las Vegas, fountains, golf courses, hotels lit up around the clock, as the reason Lake Mead is disappearing. The numbers say otherwise. Southern Nevada's entire annual allocation from the river is a small fraction of what Arizona or California receive, and agriculture across the Southwest consumes the overwhelming majority of the river's water, not cities. Las Vegas, in fact, has become one of the most water-efficient large metro areas in North America, and for 2 decades, while state negotiations stalled, it quietly built its way out of dependence on luck. The first move was tearing out grass. Ornamental lawns nobody walked on were consuming huge volumes of water purely for appearance. So the region began paying homeowners to rip them out and replace them with desert landscaping. Hundreds of millions of square feet have been removed since the late 1990s, saving an enormous volume of water. And by 2027, non-functional grass will be banned from using river water altogether. The results show, even as the metro area added close to 1 million new residents over the past 2 decades, its total water draw didn't rise to match because per-person consumption fell by more than half. The second move was recycling. Nearly everything used indoors in Las Vegas gets treated and returned to the lake, so the city earns credit for it. Gross withdrawals run well above its formal allocation, but net consumption stays close to the limit because roughly half of what's drawn out goes right back in. The third move is the one that gives this story its name. Lake Mead originally fed the city through 2 intake pipes built decades ago, engineered for a lake nobody expected to fall this low. As the water dropped through the 2000s, engineers realized those intakes would eventually be left high and dry above the waterline. So in 2005, the Water Authority approved something far more ambitious. A third intake, drilled not from above, but from below, deep under the lakebed itself. Construction crews spent years boring nearly 2 miles through solid rock and waterlogged, fault-riddled ground hundreds of feet beneath an active reservoir, with millions of tons of water pressing down above them, and no quick way out if something went wrong. The finished tunnel, anchored to the lake floor with more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete, became operational in 2015 and is considered one of the most technically demanding tunneling projects completed anywhere in the world that decade. Even that wasn't enough on its own. The new intake initially shared pumping equipment that limited how low it could reach. So the authority built a dedicated low lake level pumping station, finished in 2020, and switched it on in 2022 at almost the exact moment the falling lake disabled one of the original pumping systems. Together, the tunnel and pumping station can draw water from as low as 875 feet above sea level, 20 feet below the dead pool line itself. In other words, if Lake Mead ever falls far enough to stop delivering water to Arizona, California, and Mexico entirely, Las Vegas would still be pulling from what remains. Quietly, alongside all of that, the region has also been banking water underground, injecting treated supply into aquifers across Nevada, Arizona, and California for later use. A stored reserve now